Kingdom of the Dead, developed by Dirigo Games in 2022, is thankfully not just another boomer shooter. For starters, it's a lot more deliberately paced than the 1000th Quake clone, and has one of the most unique art styles you're ever going to see. Other than maybe Mundawn or Return of the Obra Dinn, I've not seen this type of pen and ink style used before, and it feels like a classic 20th century horror tale like Dracula or Frankenstein come to life. But does it have the action or the atmosphere to back up its pretty face? Well, let's get stuck in like a hungry vampire and find out. There's not much story to Kingdom of the Dead, but it has a nice, straightforward hook that sums up pretty much everything you're doing in-game. You're the capable Agent Chamberlain, a former professor turned high-ranking officer of the supernatural task force known as Gatekeeper, which is at war with death itself and his legions of monsters. As bosses taunt or warn you at each milestone of your progress, you begin to feel like you're part of their worst nightmare come to life. Basically, this is the first-person Van Helsing game adaptation I always wanted to play. And while the game sort of shuttles you around from level to level doing mostly the same thing, once the game gets to its finale, there's a pretty unexpected twist that will be fun for players who didn't get it accidentally spoiled in Steam discussions. You suck. You know who you are. Now, no matter what you think of the game overall, I think most would agree with me that this game looks incredible. Each texture is hand-drawn and then scanned in as evidenced by videos on Dirigo Games' Twitter account, and this is really the game's primary draw. Now, not only is this technically impressive, but man, do some of these areas pop, like the lightning splitting the sky above in half. Now, not every level sings, as they're often so big that they start to feel empty and lacking in detail, but man, when the devs lean in and really craft an area, it justifies the whole experience as unique, like the shipping yard filled with whale skeletons. The only real critique I can make of the visuals is how overly dark some areas are so that you can't make out enemies. There are other visual options that tint the screen different colors so you can kind of scroll through and see if anything else appeals to you more than the default options. I found the one that gives a slight glow to everything the most pleasing, as it increases the brightness ever so slightly and makes everything look very otherworldly. As for the game's sound quality, there's no voice acting, but there are some light and brief little text exchanges between the bosses and Chamberlain as they taunt him throughout missions, or when Chamberlain trades barbs with his sarcastic talking sword. The music is some of the best you'll ever hear in the indie scene, though. Some of it's fairly dissonant and a little challenging to listen to, but the vast majority is catchy and weird and strangely not out of place, despite being an experimental synthesizer soundtrack laid over a Weird West shooter setting. Monsters have some pretty cool roars and cries as they attack or die, and they're distinct enough that you can tell who's around the corner and prepare yourself accordingly. Unfortunately, the game's gun effects are pretty underwhelming, which is a nice segue into the combat and general gameplay elements. Kingdom of the Dead sets itself apart from the indie boomer shooter crowd with its period-appropriate arsenal of weapons like a long-barreled Colt revolver, double-barreled shotgun, lever-action rifle, Gatling gun, and what I can only think should be called a portable mortar. Much like the as-yet-unreleased Cultic, headshots are king here and are the difference between owning the battlefield or being overrun. The pistol sounds decent and has this nice animation flourish every time you get a headshot, but the rest of the arsenal just feels a little off. The sword's hit detection is heinous, and the actual sword graphic doesn't match its actual reach in the game's code. The shotgun sounds like someone kicking over a laundry basket, and it has this weird hitch in its reload animation where it makes you think it's ready to fire again, but then nothing happens until a split second later. While it's certainly possible to kill two enemies at once with this thing, it has no range and its spread is really hard to predict. This one's good for conquering the worm boss, killing harpies as they swoop in, and the tough pinky light monsters, but is otherwise a last resort for me. The lever-action rifle sounds a little too quiet for me and looks like a broom handle, but thankfully it's exactly what you need against high-health enemies that you have no desire to get close to, and is one of your better choices overall. The mortar's splash damage is pretty off though, hitting you often even if aiming well above ground level, so I only used it when absolutely necessary. The Gatling gun's pretty effective though, and some good fun to unleash your rage with after the tedious amount of precision other weapons require. Most weapons also have an alternate, like the sword getting an AoE attack after killing enough bad guys in a row, or burst firing the pistol, but these are often just curiosities you can indulge versus being legitimately helpful strategic options. Now, while there are some really cool looking and sounding enemies, they all tend to have kind of janky, puppet-like animations, and many of them are a real pain in the ass to engage. The basic gun-wielding humanoid twitch a lot, or bend over backwards to shoot shoot you, and this makes them weirdly hard to get a beat on, especially annoying when their weapons are highly damaging and never miss except at range. They also had this awful way of shooting through walls to hit you once you've alerted them, or getting stuck in walls and being able to shoot out at you but not being able to take damage themselves. Now, I will say it's pretty freaking cool to hear their bullets whistle past you when they're firing from long range, though. I could use a lot more of that adrenaline rush in other games, to be honest. The rest of the enemy roster is pretty decent, and it reminds me of Doom's Rogues Gallery hierarchy. Basic enemies include the marionette-like undead sword wielders and pistol, shotgunner, and rifle varieties of undead cowboy dudes, but you'll come across many fantastic creatures like these auto-aiming cacodemon types that take a ton of damage, pinky-style charger creatures, the annoyingly hard-to-dodge harpies, and these incredibly weak specter types that throat-sing until they're killed. A lot of them require different weapon types to take down and force impromptu strategies from you as they appear, so while they're a little clunky looking and acting, their basic theory and function is more interesting than your average shooter. Now, there are many more enemy types, but the bosses really steal the show visually, especially the giant vampire bat that has graced much of the marketing. There are a lot of these giant, possessed-looking animals as bosses, and now I'm not really sure why Death would enlist such a specific workforce, but they're nevertheless very fun to look at. What's a little disappointing is how easily they're put down. Most bosses have very little health or such simple movesets that they're dead almost as soon as the fight starts, especially one worm boss that you can take out nearly half the health bar of while he's coming up through the floor to a fighting stance. Now, I appreciate their spectacle, but the bosses are either defenseless or balanced so you basically would have to be able to kill them fast because of how unavoidable their attacks are. It just seems like a missed opportunity to make memorable looking bosses and a great art style anything more than mild annoyances. Now, going toe to cloven hoof with these monsters is usually decent fun, but the levels don't always do their best to contribute to fun battlefields. What's strange is how much or how little space you have to move around in depending on the level. Some levels have Thief Dark Project level of dead space in them, and others feel like being crammed into a phone booth. Booth? A phone booth. And others feel like being crammed into a phone booth. Neither are ideal. Neither? Neither? What am I doing?
Keep it together, man!
Other than the secondary objectives that are located in various side passages and are required to unlock subsequent levels, there are no secrets and no real alternative paths to consider. So aside from random item drops littered throughout the levels, there's really no reason to explore, and so I ended up speedrunning towards the waypoint quite often. That there was not enough incidental detail to be worth stopping and looking at was another black mark. Then the opposite problem occurs in the last level and several areas before where the mediocre platforming is required, where the game jams you up at tight spaces and laughs at you while the nearly undodgeable harpies swoop in to have your health bar, or you're beset by fast little wolf things that the floppy aiming can't keep up with. I was a bit let down by the locations you go to, as while there are great moments like the opening mansion level, a sinking ship that you must escape, or a train that comes out of nowhere and requires split-second reflexes to dodge, most levels end up looking pretty empty and kind of the same as the next. Factor that in with the boss fights being under-designed, the same enemies popping up in every location, whether in a factory or a crypt, and I felt like the game wasn't working in its own best interests. It was getting me hooked, but it was rarely capitalizing on its potential or taking me to enough cool places. And as far as replayability goes, each level can be completed on one of 3 difficulties. The first is pretty much just playing as a straight-up shooter. The second has you requiring a MacGuffin before you can get full completion and then move on to the next level or unlock the final level. And the third requires a different MacGuffin in that you both rescue and keep alive all prisoners in a level. Beyond the main game, there's an endless mode that just got added recently. This is on a really well-designed map with lots of depth and lots of places to run away and kite enemies and draw them into traps and ambushes of all types. And while it's not the easiest thing they'll ever play, as there really only seems to be a Gatling gun on the map aside from the basic pistol and dynamite, it is a pretty good adrenaline rush and a nice little distraction if you're looking to get your shoot on and not have to worry about those objectives. So all told, Kingdom of the Dead never quite reaches the heights that screenshots and its demo suggested it would be reaching for. But I can't say I didn't enjoy my time with the game. And I hope it's something that Dirigo sees enough success for that they're interested in refining the formula in a sequel or a spiritual successor. I'm not mad, and I'm not truly disappointed, but I did expect a little bit more out of this one. The glass half full reading, though, is that the game looks really good, is a nice change up in tempo and subject matter from your average quick clone, and will likely appeal to those folks who've wanted to roleplay as a monster hunter like Hellboy, Van Helsing, or the movie Constantine. I know I certainly have. So gird yourself with a stout heart and some heavy-duty weaponry, and face death, if you dare.